Hello and welcome to Nevermind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. Or rather, welcome to another special joint edition with John Potter and the Lib Dem pod team. Just before I hand over to John, a quick reminder of my weekly email newsletter all about political polling, The Week in Polls. You can sign up to it for free at theweekinpolls.co.uk. And with that, over to John.
Hello everyone, we're in week 2, the dramatic second week of the general election campaign. I'm John Potter, I'm the producer and I host the Lib Dem podcast, and with me once again is Mark Pack from the Nevermind the Bar Charts podcast, noted author and the host. Not the host, I've already said he's the host of the Nevermind the Bar Charts podcast. He's actually the party president.
The election's getting to you already, John.
It is. There's too many things to juggle. That is exactly what it is. Hello, Mark. Welcome again.
Lovely to join you again.
But very excited, we have a couple of newbies on the podcast as well. Firstly, we have Victoria Collins, who is our target candidate for the very exciting constituency of Harpenden and Berkhamsted. How are you doing, Victoria?
Thank you for having me. Take you a break from the campaign trail.
We won't keep you long because otherwise,
I'll back out straight away. Yeah.
But obviously, me and Victoria have been trying to get this organised for a very long time for her to come on the podcast. So this is really exciting. And joining us for his first also appearance is Colin Eldridge, who was a former target seat candidate and obviously a very good friend of Tom Morrison up in Cheadle as well. Hello, Colin.
Yeah, candidate in Liverpool Wavertree, target seat, lost to a Luciana Berger, who ended up being one of us. So famed for that. I was a candidate in Liverpool twice, 2005, 2010. And a long time ago, when I was wearing short trousers, I stood against Liam Fox in what was then the Woodspring constituency.
Oh, wow.
Now North Somerset. And so that was in 2001.
And those watching this on YouTube will be thinking, but Colin, you don't look nearly old enough to have done that.
I was very young. But at the time I was the youngest councillor in Britain when I stood in. In fact, I think I stood for election 6 times before I was 30. So now I'm sort of more of a humble leaflet deliverer, helping in the Newbury constituency some of the time, which is a moving forward plus seat, which we're very excited about, and obviously, Tom in Cheadle, who I think is a red hot favourite, as I'm sure many people will know. So.
Absolutely. No, well, welcome aboard, Colin. Really good to see you. So I think there's lots of things to talk about this week. What's happened in the last week? We've had the leadership debate, which was last night as we're recording. Nigel Farage has entered the fray, and I know many of us won't want us to talk about Nigel Farage, but it is a significant impact on the rest of this campaign. So we do have to touch on what that means for not just the Tories, but Labour and us. But first of all, I think, Victoria, we should start with you because you are on the ground as a target candidate. Yeah. How has that been this last week as it really gears up?
Well, I think, as you said, first of all, it's so strange to think it's week 2. I think a lot of us semi-expected it. I was convinced it was going to be May the 2nd, so we were kind of gearing up for then. But it was a small shock when it was called. So the first week was like just go, go, go. But now there's a real sense of momentum, which is great. So Friday we had a Davy came over. So you may have seen, we did some kind of baking in Harpenden. And what was great though, it was so surreal. I've never baked with kids in front of about 15 cameras. So trying to kind of work out, measuring your food properly. But no, it was really lovely. And then also there's a big launch in Berkhamsted. And what I loved about that is that Rishi Sunak had snuck into town and done a very quiet, almost like selfie with the candidate in Berkhamsted. And we came, of course, with the big Yellow Hammer 1 bus and had a big kickoff. We then launched our 2 hubs. Now I'm in a big constituency which has 2 heads, really, Harpenden and Berkhamsted. So we've launched those hubs. And it's really exciting, that sense of momentum. But what I'm very conscious about is the fact that actually, sadly, what the Tories have done is really broken down that trust. And a lot of people are still disillusioned. So that the next few weeks for me, it's really important that we keep talking to as many people as possible, because it's not in the bag yet. There are so many people who just go, actually, I'm not sure what to do. You all seem the same, but we know that actually once we speak to them, they're like, actually, I do know who you are. We need to make that difference. So for me, it's keeping that momentum up, bringing people over, and also showing that the Lib Dems are the ones who can beat the Conservatives as we know it, as the media drowns us out or can, is to keep that ground game alive and make sure we win on the 4th of July.
I suppose, Mark, we always talk about the value of canvassing as being one of the best indicators of a winning campaign. But in an election where I think 50% of the population have yet to decide which way they're going to vote, this is now beyond crucial.
And I think Victoria hasn't mentioned the best reason to go canvassing in her constituency, because I think I've got it right, haven't I? That the village of Aldbury is just within your constituency.
It is, yeah.
Which may not be a name that's familiar to people, but if you see it, the odds are you'll recognise it from episodes of Doctor Who or the Avengers. It's almost got this quintessential English village look with a couple of pubs and the village green. It is one of the most filmed sort of villages, isn't it? And so perish the thought there are any Liberal Democrat canvassers who are fans of such TV shows, but if they just happen to be, definitely Victoria's seat is the one to head to.
You've just made me think, like, I think one of our campaign strategies today will be pull out all of the major film scenes and just call all the people who are fans of those to get them.
Actually, I do hope nobody organising Ed's tour has actually realises that, because just think what props Ed might turn up with next time.
Ed Davey as Doctor Who.
Ed Davey popping out of a TARDIS.
Can we put you to for a
how
yellow
else do you
TARDIS?
Transport all the bar charts around the country? You need something that's bigger on the inside to be able to fit all the bar charts in. So.
I will say, just quickly, so actually, one of the doors I knocked on about 3 weeks ago, I opened the door and there was a Dalek, a full-size Dalek in the hallway. So, like, this is definitely a thing we can do. So we'll come back to that, John.
I apologise that the party's recently produced canvassing guide didn't include a section on what to do if the door is answered by A, a Dalek, B, a Sontaran.
Yeah, exactly.
C, River Song, D.
Exactly.
I mean, Colin, what's been your impressions of the last week as we've moved forward and it's proper? I mean, because like Victoria said, the first week it's almost like kind of mad panic. We've got to hit those Royal Mail deadlines, and now it's kind of right. Stuff is off to print. Let's go.
So I think that you still kind of reflect on the fact that the Tories did sort of a surprise election, and actually we weren't surprised. I mean, it's super impressive. All of our targets seem to be super organised. Posters going up, flying starts leaflets going out. It's just so I don't think that they've caught us by surprise. To go back to a point that you were going to talk about, I think Reform were the party that were most caught out by this. I mean, they have probably very limited organisation, and they just weren't ready or prepared, and that's why we've seen the kind of Farage he is going to circus. But ultimately, we know that actually to win an individual constituency, your ground game has got to be great. And it doesn't matter which party you are, you've got to have a ground game. And so where we are prepared and organised, we're doing a great job, right? Even in seats perhaps like yours in Preston, which is not a target seat, but we've got a campaign to run and we'll have hopefully a real progression. I wonder if Reform are the people that are going to suffer the most, because they probably just don't have any kind of ground organisation.
And I'm trying to figure out the shifting patterns. I mean, you've mentioned about Farage, and Farage is obviously going to. I mean, it's universally, I think is what a third of Tory voters would consider voting Reform. And Mark's going to correct me if I'm wrong on any of these facts. But also, there's a lot of shifting like kind of demographics happening at the moment. What do the Greens do to the far left of the Labour vote? What do independent kind of, seen ones with in Preston, the urban seat in Preston, we do have an independent pro-Gaza kind of candidate that's really going to challenge Labour there and cause them some problems. But then you've got us also taking votes from Labour, some from the Tories, and obviously our natural level of support as well. It's a really difficult mix. And that's why I suppose, Mark, it then comes on to the polling that's happened at this thing. I mean, how reliable should we take some of these polls? I mean, one of them says Labour will win everything in the Northwest, barring the Speaker's seat, and then 3 Lib Dem seats in Cheadle, Hazel Grove, and Tim's up in the Lakes.
I think in terms of overall voting intentions, the polls get it right basically 6 elections out of 7. So from that point of view, the polls consistently show the Tories are a long way behind, and we can be pretty confident that's the real situation. It's also the case that actually we as a party tend to do best when one or other party is a long way ahead, because it's when they're really close that we tend to get squeezed because people feel, oh, I've got to choose Labour or Tory to determine who's going to be Prime Minister. So I think in terms of both our personal views about the government and also the party's interests, that's actually not a bad backdrop at all for campaigns like Victoria's. There are a lot of MRPs out at the moment, and MRPs are not some special magical source of wisdom. They're a very sophisticated, complicated tool that you can do well and you can do badly. I think some of the MRPs that I've looked at have very eyebrow raising individual constituency results, and you sort of think, hard to believe they've got their model right. On the other hand, the YouGov MRP, for example, has a pretty good track record, not perfect, but pretty good. So I think it definitely is the case that it looks like the distribution of votes is such that people like Victoria have a really good chance that we can definitely buck the trend in our targets. And that's something the MRPs weren't saying in 2019. So it's not just me, because I'm party president in election campaign, having to talk up the party. I think they genuinely, this shows that if we get it right, there is a real opportunity. As for, the huge number of seats that some of them show will go Labour, well, if the government loses by 20 odd points, that's sort of what happens. And people with long memories may remember Chris Leslie in Shipley in 1997. And that was, Labour are never going to win somewhere like Shipley. And I don't think Chris Leslie himself really expected to win. But in that sort of environment, the sort of seats that have never voted Labour, sometimes do, if there isn't another strong challenger, like there is, we are, in many seats. So I think the MRPs overall are a bit variable in quality, but they are broadly getting the picture right, almost certainly, as are the national polls.
Can I just ask one question? When I've looked at those MRP polls, the YouGov one you mentioned, there seems to be a bit of a bias towards the party that came second last time. So there are certain seats that I looked at and went, there is no way that seat is going to go to that party just because, the demographics are just impossible. Is that something that's built into the formula?
Yeah, I mean, I think
make an assumption about the natural challenge to the Tories doing better.
I mean, I think that definitely is an important factor, and it's why, I think there are seats like, say, Woking would be a really good example, just to pick a different example from Victoria for a moment, where if you look at the election result last time, local election progress that we've made, how poorly Labour's done in local elections, it's reasonable to expect it will be a very different picture in Woking from the national sort of swing to Labour. But I do think I'm always slightly cautious about some of those demographic arguments, because people made them in Scotland about Labour seats ahead of 2015, and Labour got, why not? So when you've got a party as on, the Tories are currently on course to do worse than they've done in any election since before letterboxes were invented. That is just, and on that basis, yeah, there will be seats, some coming to us, some going to Labour, obviously, the Tories will lose, that it's been unthinkable that they would lose in the past. So I think definitely, when demography is not destiny.
No.
And the Conservatives are so far on course to do a very heavy bit of record book rewriting. And the great thing is the opportunity for us, that, the opportunity for people like Victoria, to get elected. And we need to have the MP for Daleks to be a Lib Dem for a change.
I just want to jump in though, so because my seat is also, it's a really exciting one because it's brand new, but it's made up of 3 seats, and one of those seats, the Conservative MP last time stood as an independent. So what we're finding is that those polls that weigh 2019 quite heavily actually really don't, or depending on how much they bring in the 2019 result, are really skewing ours. Now, there's many where we're ahead or a close second, and people on the ground know that. But I think it's also just highlighting that, especially when there are boundary changes, and there's a seat like mine, which is such a big boundary change, that actually it's good to see that. But my work on the ground is to show, actually, if we look at the 2019 result in Harpenden, if we look at our locals, if we just, people know here that we're the ones to beat, is actually focusing more on that to make sure that it pushes through some of those, because the Conservatives are also using, there's one poll or one analysis which shows that Labour can win, which is really not true at all, and people here know that. But the Conservatives are pushing that agenda clearly to split the vote. So I just wanted to highlight that in new seats like mine, it can be a bit more complex, especially when you had a 2019 result, which was also slightly different.
But it can also
also particularly where the boundary changes bring in somewhere that we've not really worked in the past. I was looking in some detail at some of the canvassing figures from one of our MP's constituencies that has some new territory brought in last night, and the canvassing is really good. And you at first you think, well, is this just someone being, people being over optimistic? But then you sort of look at the sort of area it is, and you think, well, it's a sort of area that could and should have voted Lib Dem previously, but because it was just next to a seat we were filing all our resources in, it got almost no campaigning, and now it's getting the full on. And I think that applies to big chunks of your seat as well, Victoria, doesn't it? That we're really working them now in a way we didn't a few years back.
And I think it's important to remember that most of the population, while lots of the population aren't engaged with politics in the absolute minutiae, and we are the weirdos in this. And we have to remember.
Speak for yourself.
No. I'm proud of it. When you have to issue a warning that too many canvassers may go to a Dalek-infested village, we know that we are the strange people in the room.
I'm going to use that to my advantage.
I shudder to think what thumbnail you're going to put on this podcast.
No, that's right, absolutely. But what's interesting is someone like Hazel Grove, which has only had very minor changes there. But, one of those polls had Labour coming out as winning it, which is clearly utterly nonsense. That doesn't stop Labour from making hay from that, because like Colin said, all of us want to kind of do well in our patches, and not everyone has the discipline to stay where they need to be. But I'm really encouraged to hear what you say, Victoria, because actually, I mean, you see that with, I think of the North Shropshire by-election as well, where that local Labour Party refused to lie down, even though it was plainly obvious that the Lib Dems were the big challengers. But we just have to be real. And another thing that's happened, which is quite interesting in Hazel Grove, is the Tories' lack of branding in terms of not putting blue on their leaflets. So I think we've worked out, of all the bits of literature that has gone out in Hazel Grove fairly recently, none of them have had Lib Dem yellow, have had Tory blue on it, but they've had a lot of Labour red on it. And so we're getting people coming up to us and saying, oh, I got this newspaper from the Labour Party, when it wasn't. It was actually a Tory one. So there are these tricks and things, but this is why, and again, I sound like a proper Lib Dem kind of geek here, but this is why content and volume is so important. Because, and I assume, because they will throw loads, and I mean, Colin, that's no different.
Well, so what I was going to say to you then is there's actually an important point about this, is because this is an election where it looks like Labour are going to do really well. Seats like Hazel Grove and Cheadle, which of course I know quite well at the moment, they are in Greater Manchester. So they do have a Labour influence. They've got a Labour mayor. They've got the local media, being the Manchester Evening News, is kind of focusing often on Labour stories. So the squeeze becomes so important. Mark will remember this. Back in 1997, there were a number of constituencies where Labour won from third place. I remember Bristol West being one. I think St Albans actually was one, if my memory serves me, because the swing nationally gets so big, people get carried away with this sort of Labour are on course for this juggernaut of an election. And our job absolutely has to be, in so many of these constituencies, to squeeze, where, Hazel Grove will be a great example. Labour vote will be going up. Labour have done a bit better in the local elections there recently than they've ever done before. We've got to squeeze them right down, and that's, one of the ways that we're going to win.
Yeah, actually, your reference to the Greater Manchester media market is actually a good illustration as well of why we all benefit from winning in our target seats, even if we don't live in the target seats. If we get one, hopefully two MPs elected in Greater Manchester, voters all across Manchester will hear and see more of the Liberal Democrats because we've got Liberal Democrat MPs in that media market. And so the next time one of our local teams is fighting to win a council ward off Labour on, say, Manchester Council, having had a Lib Dem MP elected a few miles away will benefit them. It will help them. And that's, I think, a really important thing to remember is that, yeah, we want John to do wonderfully well. We want the hilarity of the other parties mixing up their nomination papers and John worrying, therefore, that he's going to become an MP. But also, we get two or three, we come out of this general election with 2 or 3 MPs in the Northwest, having taken a step forward from just the one at the moment. John, that helps you, winning more council seats in Preston because it's more Lib Dems in the regional media, in the national media, being seen, being read about by voters in your target wards.
And which is why, again, most people watching this will have had letters from HQ telling them where their target seats are, etc. I'm in Stockport the next 2 days, so doing these sorts of things are really important. But let's shift to the person we really didn't want to see in this election, and that is Mr. Farage. He has arrived, and unbelievable.
How many people cheered yesterday when they saw that he'd had a milkshake thrown over him?
Come on,
be honest.
I'm one of those things. I didn't cheer because I think it makes him into the martyr that he always pretends to be for me. I think, obviously, there is an amusing thing of a banana milkshake hitting, but I just thought, don't throw anything at politicians because it just encourages other people to do it.
And also, and there is a genuine safety issue. It's what, 2 MPs have been murdered in recent years. I think, there is a real issue about safety of MPs and parliamentary candidates. And as it's like with arguing in favour of freedom of speech, you have to be in favour of freedom of speech, people you disagree with. Basic physical safety for people taking part in politics is important. Because actually one of the few things I would say in Nigel Farage's favour, one is he supports electoral reform. So we have to
at the moment
we have to at least agree with him on that. Yeah. But the other is he is willing to put his name on the line by taking part in the democratic process and letting voters choose. And there are all sorts of unpleasant populist extremists who throw all sorts of bile from the sidelines, but always run away from actually facing the public's verdict. I think, our politics is better for people like him being part of it than being wholly outside it.
And I suppose if you believe in electoral reform, and this was the argument you have to think is that, yes, first past the post stops us from getting the representation, but it also stops whether it was the BNP back in the day. But that doesn't go away, that support. It just morphs into... So the BNP morphed into UKIP, which has now morphed into the Tory party. A lot of that vote doesn't go. It just changes its location. But so Farage there is a series of the population that believes in Farage, what he stands for, and to deny it just lets it fester and grow. But he is in now this thing. I will say, I'm absolutely sure, Mark, he only stood because he's done private polling in Clacton, thought he could. He pretty much knows he's going to win, or has a good guess of it. But what it does do is bring in an element. Now, Victoria, as someone who's taking on the Tories here, what do you think? Because there might be, lots of Tories that think, well, I'm either going to be Conservative or I'm going to vote for Victoria this time as the Lib Dem child. What do you think Reform and Nigel Farage prominence is going to do to that kind of Tory switching vote?
Well, I think so. We've had a Reform candidate for a small while. What's interesting though is and I think we all know this, is that the Reform vote has become that protest vote, and to be honest, it's not that strong here in Harpenden and Berkhamsted. What is the strongest is actually people who are disillusioned and just don't know where to go. That's where most people just say. And actually, it's a lot of, I think, soft Tories who I think would like to come to us, but that's why that canvassing is so important. But what I think we found is that it's people who they're just kind of almost giving up and want to to change things, and that I think Nigel Farage and the reform vote is actually shaping Tory policy more than anything else.
Yeah.
So what we see is that they're trying to focus on the kind of local stuff. We see nationally as well. I think everything they're doing on immigration is clearly to try and bring those voters over. So interestingly, it's more watching what the Tory party do. And here locally is to say, actually, if you want to change, maybe I'm the woman to vote for. But if not, is to think about. Well, there are some reform voters. I just say thank you very much and leave them to it. But there haven't been that many, quite frankly.
There are some reform voters who are basically anti-politics, aren't they? And so there is a possibility of winning them over.
Yeah. Because it's this what's so interesting is sometimes I open the door and you feel this, well, they open the door, you feel this frustration, and all I'm there is to listen and say, okay, well, actually, here's my leaflet. If you've got any questions, and I kind of start to walk away, but then they go, actually, I'm just really frustrated, and they just want to be listened to by politicians, or they want to feel like someone cares, and that's what I find so interesting. That sometimes that protest vote is because they felt ignored for so long. It's not necessarily because they buy into the policies, but because they want someone to be there for them. And that's what I try and get across on the doorstep for those voters that are in the right line to potentially vote Lib Dem.
And I suppose I remember because during the coalition, when I was, when I kept my council seat, at times you just got to let people vent. And when you're thinking, and actually there was a big thing is once they vented and actually said, right, I've got over my whatever anger about this, that, and the other. I'm now ready to give you a fair hearing and stuff like that. And I think, this is the power of canvassing is that it allows people to get that out of the system almost. And then you can try and engage on what you want to engage with. But I'm really interested, Colin, in what you think. There's loads of talk about how it splits the right vote, Reform and Nigel Farage. But actually, I'm really interested in what it does to Labour. Now, because
I think what Victoria said is actually spot on. That okay, there is a group of voters out there that are, probably previous. They're fairly right wing. They're fairly potentially BNP type voters. But I think that's quite a small group of people, actually. Yeah. I think there's a large group of people who are just incredibly frustrated, incredibly we can call them anti-politics. They just don't feel like democracy is working for them. And, whether we like it or not, Farage gets the media attention. He says some outrageous stuff sometimes, but really he's speaking to a narrative of these people that feel that they aren't being listened to. And if we look at, the previous election, a lot of those sort of blue wall seats that we saw, sorry, red wall seats, I should say, we saw in the north going blue was partly, I think, about this whole narrative, people not being listened to, feeling like that, having been Labour for generations, they weren't getting that voice heard. I think it's the same reason that SNP swept Scotland, because there was a sense that Labour weren't listening to them or weren't understanding their frustrations. And so I guess for our point of view, Victoria's made a great point, I think, which is that the more we can engage with the public, and you said it, John, about your council seat, the more we can engage, canvass, connect, the more we can, perhaps feed into some of this anti-politics vibe that's there.
And it's really important, from my point of view, is not to look down or sneer at people's choices. And I think of Burnley. This was maybe 2 decades ago when the BNP had the same number of councillors as the Lib Dems and became within a hair's breadth of nearly becoming the opposition for the first time. And the Lib Dems stepped up and said, no, actually. Because that was all about Labour has been taking Burnley for granted for so long. And it became a natural voice of apathy was to go with the BNP. But actually, the Lib Dems rolled up their sleeves and then took all those seats. And now, obviously, they don't exist anymore. There isn't anything like that in Burnley now. And I think so. It's up to us to be that voice, Mark, and just say, if people are apathetical, which I completely get. But the way we do that is by actually campaigning, you see it, where we campaign well, turnout tends to go up.
Yeah. And it's by listening to what matters to them and then finding the thing that overlaps between what we believe and what they're concerned about. And as you say, that can mean, therefore, that and you saw this actually with both Labour and the Lib Dems in many areas when the BNP had their flurry of electoral success. Both Labour and Lib Dem policy outlooks, philosophies, etc., very, very different to the BNP. But both parties, in our different ways, were quite successful at taking the electoral fight back to the BNP by listening to what was of concern to voters and finding the overlap. And, in the Lib Dem case, it was very often about basic neglect of communities by a distant council, and therefore you can appeal to that. And I think that's important in winning over some of the people who voted Leave, who are willing to think about voting Lib Dem this time. They often think that Brexit hasn't gone well. They're unhappy with the overall record of the government. And if our starting point is, yeah, it's your fault, you got it wrong, why would they listen to us? But if our starting point is sympathy and finding some common ground on the NHS, on sewage, wouldn't it be better if we got rid of some of those awful new trade barriers with Europe? Then we can begin to win them over. And it's about finding the overlap always.
Yeah, I think also the point about Brexit is absolutely crucial. I mean, Brexit was a vote about frustration about government.
Exactly.
Someone to blame, or some people blamed Brussels. They blamed the EU. It's the kind of sense of no one's listening to me that is, I think, very prevalent, and we there is an opportunity for us to tap into it, like you say, and listen.
Yeah, and again, we've talked on this podcast. We've had like canvassing training, kind of 101 episodes on this podcast about the first thing you do is you don't if you disagree with people, you don't come at them with aggression. You come at them from listening. And another really thing I say to new candidates and campaigners is, they don't have to agree with you to vote with you. I know it sounds because again, we're in this bubble. We think how could someone be a Leaver and still vote John Potter? But actually, that's
how
not
could
the
anyone
reality.
meet you and think vote John Potter? But
yeah, have you been talking to my wife again? Honestly, I don't know. But let's.
Meet Victoria, meet Colin, vote for them. I get, but
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a struggle. I have to do extra leaflets. But Victoria, last night. One of the big, I don't know whether you do think it's a set piece. We had the leadership debate between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. I mean, firstly, did you watch it? And secondly, what were your thoughts?
So I'm going to make a terrible confession, because right now I'm so focused on our campaigns. I was sorting out our canvassing, so I didn't see it, but I saw snippets and kind of the highlights from it. But I think one of the really interesting analysis is how, the 45-second answers is that actually there was a lack of real debate, and that it was like forcing again politicians to speak in sound bites. And I think in a way, coming back to what we've said, is we've got to remember people are getting their information from now algorithms and sound bites that are feeding their fears in different ways. And I worry that actually last night was just another bunch of sound bites that are just going to go different ways and not actually add to the debate.
Well, I did. And Colin, Mark, did either of you watch the debate last night? Yeah, I assume Mark.
I was typing data into a spreadsheet while listening. The perfect
very Mark
to do
Pack.
Yeah, that's it, absolutely. But for me, Mark, it was. I actually thought Sunak came out punching more. I think he was clear. I mean, this is nothing new. He was very tetchy and irritable on most things that he does in terms of public speaking when he's challenged. But I think my biggest surprise was how unnerved Keir Starmer seemed.
Well, it made me feel really old, because there's this standard trope of, that you say more and more as you get older of, people aren't as good as they used to be and all of that. And it did just strike me that compared to sort of Cameron Brown Clegg, say, in 2010, it just, are those two really the best that our political system has to offer? Answer no, obviously, because of Ed. But, I mean, neither of them really, for all of the many, many things, I think Gordon Brown got wrong and he should be criticised for, he was clearly one of the preeminent political talents of his generation. And likewise, actually, I'd say that about David Cameron, not as much of an intellectual heavyweight as Gordon Brown, but he, you could sort of see, you can see it now with the stuff, the video clips he's done as Foreign Secretary of why, he's a former prime minister. I just thought both Sunak and Starmer were disappointingly second tier, really.
And I suppose, Colin, I think I put on my my local council's group WhatsApp. I said, well, it's better than Boris Johnson versus Corbyn, but not by much.
Not by much. I mean, my kind of just general view is I just think a bit like candidate debates that Victoria will be going to, in the kind of town hall where, actually what happens is it's the people in the audience are almost all people who've made up their mind. They're the politicos. It involves a huge amount of energy. I'm sure Victoria will be super nervous about it, doesn't want to make a mistake, doesn't want to say something wrong. She'll get attacked by her opponents, probably doesn't move the dial very much. And my impression of last night is simply that. I suspect opinion polls won't change very much at all.
Very few debates do move the polls. I mean, that's the basic pattern of politics and debates.
I mean, do you think, is it actually ever worthwhile doing them then, Mark? I mean, I suppose the idea is that you don't want to be seen to not do them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in a way, debates are a bit like actually general election manifestos, because manifestos very rarely alter the election result, because actually it's very rare for whoever's in the lead to even change during an election campaign. But both manifestos and debates, I think, have an important role, both in principle about what democracy's like and how it should work, but also in practice, because they're about, in part, setting the scene for after polling day. And so I think they do matter, but probably what matters most is not so much whether Sunak clawed back a bit of ground versus Starmer, but it's what the impression of Starmer that it helped set for what people's views are going to be of him as Prime Minister. And, at the moment, it looks like he is most likely to be Prime Minister, but will be Prime Minister starting in a very brittle sort of political situation. He will be Prime Minister, and very, very few party leaders, especially Labour leaders, get to be Prime Minister. So kudos to him for that, if that is what happens. But he won't have that sort of groundswell of initial, popularity that most new Prime Ministers do. And that perhaps is important for who knows what politics will bring next year. But, we might well look back on that as the debates did actually matter a bit in that sense.
I think what debates can help is with morale of your own side. I mean, I think, if you have a great performance, your team are G'd up and you might get another 5 or 10% out of your team in the campaign. But I don't think they make much difference turning the dial, like we said, in terms of.
So perhaps the real winner are the Lib Dems, because of all of us being fired up by being so put off by what we saw.
I will say, what's interesting? I know I always use I have lots of family members who aren't massively political. And actually, I had a call from my old man up in Cumbria, and he rang me up yesterday. He goes, hey, he's not that keen on the stunts. I'll let that down. He's of an age, but he just went, I tell you what, that Daisy Cooper you've got so good. And I thought that was interesting, that she's actually cut across quite well, and how much she's been put to the front has been really interesting. But we're now going to go, our final bit of this episode is obviously what's coming in the week to come. So now, as we're getting, obviously, we'll know by Friday what candidates are where. And it is interesting how short a time period this is. And I got my forms in yesterday. But really, you're talking about some councils have given you maybe 3-4 days in order to get, and whether you get them wrong. So I do wonder whether some of independents and smaller parties will struggle to get get their forms in and get them right. But also, a really crucial thing is we are now pretty much, it's less than 2 weeks before the postal votes land. And in an apathetical kind of election, then actually people that you are very, very highly likely to vote are going to be absolutely key. So for you, Colin, this next week coming, what do you think are going to be the big issues that happen? Is it going to be what happens? I suppose also the next polls, what happens with Farage turning up? What's going to be the big thing for you?
Yeah, so I think that there's 2 parts, isn't there? For the local campaigns and campaigners, there's, as you said, postal votes to think about, free posts to get organised. I mean, free posts can be an absolute kind of nightmare, and just trying to organise the boxes and getting all the stuff to the post office in the right order, the way they want it, and etc. So there's a lot of work going on the ground, and I feel really for all the agents and organisers around the country who are, already sleepless, stressed, kind of having to organise all of that. I think on the national side of things, what I think is going to be interesting is if this pattern of polling continues, what do the Tories do? they are clearly going to lose at the moment. And simply to carry on with the same campaign for the next 4 or 5 weeks there'll be a lot more pressure coming on to change tack, different strategy. At the moment, it's very Sunak-centric. Will they start to bring other players in? Will the infighting happen? Will they, obviously there's some potential leadership candidates that might start flexing. So I think that's the interesting dimension that could come over the next few weeks. Farage puts pressure on the Tories probably more than other parties. So was that, I think, we're all to see, let's say.
Mark, what about yourself? I'm going to leave the final word to
if anyone is turning up to help in a target seat, little tip, bring a handful of elastic bands with you. This is peak risk of running out of elastic band season as you are bundling your election addresses and the like. So, but yeah, I mean, it is scary and exhilarating to think we're about a fortnight away as we record from the first votes being cast from people looking at, John's name and Victoria's name and on ballot papers. And that is scary for all the things we've got to do, but also actually, if the polls and the public and so on are in the same mood when the votes are being cast as they are at the moment, we've got a chance of a really cracking election result. So it's also quite exciting that we might be just a few weeks away from finally breaking out of the level of sort of MPs and so on and public profile that we've been trapped in for a decade and more. So, but we have to remember to get it right. Our track record is over optimism. 5 elections in a row, we've all gone too optimistic, gone for too many seats. We really need to keep our heads focused on getting people like Victoria elected, and lots of useful stuff we can do in other seats to build up our organisation to help win future elections. But the big measure of success is Victoria elected in Harpenden and Berkhamsted, is Josh elected in Eastbourne, is Monica elected in Esher and Walton, are Tom and Lisa elected in the Northwest, and so on.
Oh, I got butterflies then, Mark. That was inspiring. Victoria,
to the letterboxes.
Finish off, Victoria. I mean, what are you doing over this next week? That is probably interesting from yours.
I mean, and what Mark said, I think, myself and our teams where we're in those advanced target seats, we've done so much work to get here, but it is not in the bag. We need as much help as possible. Absolutely. And all that we've talked about, kind of that apathy, that also keeping that squeeze alive is so essential. So my week is basically canvassing, leaflets, calls, canvassing. And I'd add that we've got 2 hubs open, one in Harpenden, one in Berkhamsted, easy to get to by train, car. We can sort out lifts, help, but we've got canvassing 3 times a day. We've got our action days every weekend. But please do help those seats. It's not over, it's not in the bag yet. But I'm very excited, and I'm just really excited to go and talk to people. That's my favourite thing, and it's making a difference. So back on the doors.
Wonderful.
And go canvassing in Victoria's seat. You might meet a Dalek.
Yes, absolutely. And I suppose the final point, it reiterates what Mark said last week, actually, is the Tories are probably going to outspend us massively. And I had some figures of how much they'd spent in Cheadle since New Year, and it's gargantuan. It's huge. Yeah. So knocking on doors, getting out those leaflets is how we stop the Tories winning this, by spending lots of money. So thank you to Victoria, to Mark, to Colin, and everyone who's watched and listened to this podcast. We really appreciate it. We'll do more next week because the news isn't going to stop. We will see what happens, but go out there, get your leaflets in, get your knocking on doors, go to your target seats, and we'll be back with another episode really soon. Thank you very much.